Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. Welcome to the webinar, Optimizing Your Cloud Spending with the Opsgility Cloud Sandbox. My name is Michael Washam. I'm the CEO of Opsgility and will be the presenter for this webinar. Before I dive into the Cloud Sandbox, I want to briefly introduce Opsgility's other services. Opsgility is one of the leading cloud enablement companies in the world. We help companies enable the cloud through online self-paced and instructor-led training. We offer global training availability, so wherever your team is, we can help. We have the broadest set of custom curriculum focused on the Microsoft Cloud available in the market today. Whatever you're trying to accomplish in the cloud, we can help. So in today's webinar, I hope you'll take away a few key understandings. The primary learning objective is to understand what the Opsgility Cloud Sandbox is and what its key benefits to you as a potential customer are. As part of that, you'll understand some of the key use cases for it in your organization. And finally, the most important part, of course, is how much the sandbox costs and how you can purchase it. Okay, let's dive right in and explain what the Opsgility Cloud Sandbox actually is. Luckily, this is a very simple concept to explain. The Cloud Sandbox is essentially a service that allows you to purchase Microsoft Azure subscriptions for your organization with full control over how much cloud spending you do for non-production workloads. The bigger question is, why would you want to purchase the cloud using our sandbox? And for that, we'll start with the first use case. Most organizations start their cloud journey by experimenting with running some non-production workloads like dev, test, and learning in the cloud first. In the world of Microsoft Azure, there are plenty of ways to get started. You can purchase a subscription with a credit card and pay as you go. You can buy Visual Studio subscriptions that also include a small amount of Azure usage. Or once you've made a commitment, you can purchase in large blocks through an enterprise agreement. There are several problems with these approaches to use Azure at scale in any good-sized organization. For instance, how do you provide access to hundreds or even thousands of employees? You certainly don't want to give them a blank check and let them use their corporate credit cards. In that case, you'll end up spending a significant amount of money on forgotten workloads that add zero value to your bottom line. How do you ensure that all of your employees have the tools they need to do their job? In this case, that's access to Azure, but also ensure that they stay within their budget. There are several third-party cloud consumption reporting services, and Microsoft Azure itself offers reporting, but none of these services will help your users from running forgotten workloads month over month, wasting company money. The final question, how do you apply governance to your Azure subscriptions at scale? Azure is really designed to apply policies and permissions per subscription, but it's very common in the enterprise to have hundreds and even potentially thousands of subscriptions at one time. Let's walk through a really quick example of some of the problems you'll run into when managing Azure subscriptions without the Opsgility Cloud Sandbox. So I'm going to leave my slides and flip over to a browser. And the very first thing I'm going to show you is actually the Microsoft Azure Enterprise Agreement portal. So this is ea.azure.com. And if you have an enterprise agreement, this is where you'll go to actually go and create subscriptions. So for instance, you're just made an EA commitment, you bought a big, large block of Azure, and you want to make sure that all 500 of your IT staff have their own subscription. This is literally what you would end up doing if you chose to go this route. First of all, you would go and create departments in the EA portal, and this could be IT, it could be marketing, it could be however you want to structure the spending of your Azure subscriptions. Once you set up your departments, you would then set up an accounts. And these are the users that can manage creating subscriptions in these departments. And the third piece is you would actually go in and you'd click the Add Subscription button. Now, in this case, if you wanted to give everyone their own unique subscription, so they had the ability to go create resource groups and deploy virtual machines and virtual networks and everything that you want them to know how to do, since you are running your company on Azure now, you would have to do this for each and every employee. And note that it basically, once I click this button and I click agree to buy, it's actually going to create an Azure subscription inside my EA. Now, this is interesting because one of the things that you'll have to do once this subscription is created, you will be the admin of this subscription. So if you want to delegate permissions to it for your new employee, you'll have to log in as that to this subscription and change the permissions on it to add that one individual employee. Now, the other thing that's interesting is there's no policies in effect right now. So that means if I did create a subscription and say I handed it to an IT professional, say this is an Azure subscription, if you've never been in the Azure portal, the IT professional can literally go in here and do anything that they want. For instance, they might say, I've heard of, the express route networking. Let me go under new networking scroll down, click Express Route, and just learning, of course, because I'm supposed to be learning this for my job. So I'm going to give it a name, and I'm going to pick a provider. I think we're doing something with AT&T NetMod, so maybe I'll pick that one. I'm in the DFW area, so I'll pick Dallas. And for bandwidth, of course, I'm going to pick 10 gigabit per second, because who wouldn't? And for SKU, I'm going to pick premium, because that, of course, sounds the best. And I'll put it in a resource group. Not really sure what that means. And that's pretty much it. So the last thing I can do is click create, and I'll see if I can learn how ExpressRoute works. Now, the interesting thing about this is the minute you hit create, your customer, or you in this case, your EA is actually going to be getting billed for this ExpressRoute circuit. And that may be okay in certain situations, but for this one, you actually are not going to be able to use it, of course, if you don't have separate agreements set up with AT&T. And the real ramification is once you see how much this costs. So if I flip over to the pricing calculator, you can see that the circuit that I just spun up inside the Azure Management Portal in whopping 15 seconds is going to cost my EA $54,000 a month. That's probably not what you intended whenever you gave your IT pro their own Azure subscriptions they could try out. And again, this isn't the only service like that. There's a lot of different easy ways of spending a significant amount of money in Azure if you don't know exactly what you're doing. Now imagine you do spin this up and you forget about it for 3 months. That's whenever this really, really gets dangerous. Okay, so that's kind of the general overview of the risk you run into with trying to provide access to Azure at scale inside your organization. And again, I'm not saying that you can't do things to protect yourself. There are services or features in Azure called policies that you can put into play that will restrict your users from doing silly things like, setting up ExpressRoute. Now, what's interesting though is that is per subscription. So to go back to our demonstration, you would have to create the subscription, add the user, then go apply the policies to that subscription, and then you'd have to go do that another 500 times if that's how many subscriptions you had for your users. Or what most customers do today, they just don't do that. None of their users have access to Azure in any meaningful way so they can learn how things work. Okay, now that you know some of the problems with using Azure at scale, let me give you a brief overview of how the Cloud Sandbox can help. The goal of the Cloud Sandbox is to allow your team to explore Azure and its full capabilities by offering them an Azure subscription to every employee that needs it without being concerned of overspending or of interfering with your production environment. What I mean by that last point is every subscription that you create in your enterprise agreement is associated with your production Azure AD tenant by default. This is certainly not desirable if you're actively building and testing new applications or workloads using Azure AD. Every Sandbox subscription offers its own unique Azure AD tenant that's completely isolated from your production environment. The Sandbox also makes it very simple to manage all of your Sandbox subscriptions by applying policies to control which services, SKUs, and regions are available. Your users should not have the ability to accidentally spend $54,000 per month. One of the most important features is the ability to enable hard quotas on your subscriptions. This allows you to know that you will never spend more than you plan on Azure usage. Every subscription can have its own unique budget with several notification thresholds. For example, once usage hits 50% of the budget, the user will be notified by email. They will receive notifications at 75% and 90% as well, and the service will actually terminate their subscription at 100%, ensuring that they do not exceed your budget. Chargeback reporting is built into the service by default. You can see spending at the company, team, and individual subscription level. And the Sandbox is also a great way to let your users prepare for their Azure certifications in conjunction with Opsgility's online training. Now let's walk through and see how you can manage Azure subscriptions with the Opsgility Cloud Sandbox this time. So again, I'm going to flip back over to my browser. And the very first thing I'm going to show you is an Opsgility Cloud Sandbox environment. So what you're seeing here is basically a very empty environment, and I did that on purpose so I can kind of show you some of the things that you would do as an organization to set up your Cloud Sandbox. So right now, very first thing I'm going to show you is that I can click on Manage Users, and this is where you can see how we actually get users into the Sandbox itself. So you can see that we already have quite a few users added up. Some of them are administrators, some of them are users. These are the people that have access to your Opsgility Cloud Sandbox. We can add multiple users, or we can add an individual user. Now, once you add users to your Cloud Sandbox, you can also create teams. So for instance, I already have 2 teams created, one for our trainers and one for our customer success team. And we also have the default team, which we're currently not using. The training team is essentially a group of our Opsgility trainers that have access to our Cloud Sandbox. And right now, the only person that actually has a subscription created is me. So if we can go back, I'm going to show you some other things about teams in just a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to show you how to actually create an Azure subscription. So the very first thing I'm going to show you is basically if I wanted to create a new subscription, all I have to do is give it a name, pick the team the user's in, which in this case is training, and the notification email. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Dan out of the list. Now, where we get the control piece is in the subscription detail section, at least the first set of controls. Very first thing you note here is I can set a budget. So if I wanted to give Dan $150 or $500, totally up to me. And I also control the reset frequency. So if I wanted to give Dan $500 every 31 days or every 90 days, or however I wanted to do it, I can set that right here. I can also set the start date. So if I want to make sure that this subscription starts on next Monday at 9 a.m., I can do that. Or if I want it to start immediately, I can do that as well. And the subscription also has an end date. So right now, this subscription is only going to be good for a month. So there actually won't be a reset. But if I wanted to give this longer, I can just pick the date and take this all the way out to the end of the year. And it's good for another almost 9 months. Now, the other thing that's interesting is you notice there is a time here. What this really means, you have the granularity to actually start a subscription at a certain time and end it at a certain time. So if you were using this for internal training, you could literally start a subscription at 8 a.m. on Monday and turn it off at 6 p.m. on Friday, and you don't have to worry about what happens to those subscriptions before or after. They're perfectly under your control. Now, a couple other things I'll show you is in our policy section. You notice by default, we have Restrict Express Route and Supported Azure Services. These are actually 2 policies that we have put into place in the sandbox that are applied to every subscription by default. So I can't actually get rid of Express Route or Supported Azure Services because the Cloud Sandbox administrator has ensured that these are always there. However, there's also other policies that I can add. For instance, if I want to make sure that Dan can only deploy workloads in East US, I can drag that policy over. Or maybe I do want him to also deploy into Central US. And these 2 policies basically allow him to deploy into those regions, but no others. And the policies are kept and created in a separate location. So you can go ahead and define these separately. We'll help you define them if you need us to. And once you're ready to create subscriptions, you can essentially add them to the subscription at creation time. And there's also one more really cool feature is ARM templates. So if you know that Dan is going to need, a Visual Studio 2017 lab machine, you can literally drag that from the available templates section over to the selected templates. And whenever I click save, what will happen is Dan will get an email whenever his subscription is ready, tell him how much his budget is, which policies are applied. And whenever he logs into Azure, the Visual Studio 2017 lab machine will already be deployed. So it works out really, really well. Allows people to bootstrap and jump right into being productive in Azure without having to worry about trying to get started. Okay, so I'm not going to create a subscription at this time, but what I am going to show you is a couple of interesting things. So if I go into training, you can see that we have our team members and my one subscription here, that we have the option to add multiple subscriptions. So this is what I meant by how do you do this at scale? So what we can do here is I can just basically add subscription over and over without jumping through multiple different screens. And by default, they'll already be assigned to a user and we can have them policies defined already. So I save several steps from creating the subscriptions in the Azure AE portal. Every one that I add here is going to automatically be configured once it's started up. So the users will automatically get notified and they'll already be running with the correct policies and budget once they're done. The other piece here that makes it interesting is editing multiple subscriptions. So if you do have 500 subscriptions or 200 subscriptions and you want to make sure they all have the same policies, it's really simple to click the checkbox here. And if I did have multiple subscriptions, they would all be checked. And if I wanted to make sure they could all use East US, all I'd have to do is click Allow East US and click Save, and every subscription in that list would have that policy applied to it. So very powerful for managing multiple subscriptions in bulk. which is a very, very common requirement in enterprise customers. All right, so now let's go back to the home page of the Cloud Sandbox, and I want to show you real quick how easy it is to get into your Azure subscription. So if I open up my subscription, and you can see there's a couple options that we have here. We have the ability to add credit. So for instance, if you did give me $500 and I was working on a very, very high-end project that we definitely did not want to see terminate right in the middle because I ran out of money, you can actually click add credit and add additional funds for this billing cycle. So maybe bump it up to $750 just this one time. So you have full control over how much money is still being spent, but you also don't disrupt a project that may need more budget than you initially thought you needed. And of course, you can remove policies. And if you actually want to see what the user is doing in their subscription, you click the Open in Azure Portal button, and it will literally pop me out into that user subscription so I can see what's going on and maybe help them or maybe delete something if I need to. So lots of powerful control mechanisms that give you the ability to take full control over your Azure spending. Now, let's flip over to another subscription that already has some consumption built into it. So this is a subscription that's actually been in use for a while. And this is roughly the reporting that you'll get from at a subscription level, a team level, or at the customer level. Essentially, you can go in and see that we have a subscription that we spent $1,125 over the last period. And the total spend, you can see kind of the average month by month, what we're spending on. You can see the daily aggregate, and you can see what this subscription has actually been used for. So you can see for the most part, it's been data services, a little bit of virtual machines, and Cortana intelligence. So we do give you some pretty good detail on where the subscription is spending its money, and then you can roll that all the way up at the customer and the team level as well. So really powerful reporting, gives you a really solid understanding of what you're actually doing in Azure spending your money. And of course, this is all about helping you optimize and keep within your budget. Okay, so now that we've kind of seen a little bit more on how the Cloud Sandbox can help you, let's talk about a couple of other interesting use cases. So the next use case I want to cover is using the Cloud Sandbox simply as an on-demand lab platform. And the reason I call this up separately is I want you to understand that you don't have to be a current Microsoft Azure customer to take advantage of the Cloud Sandbox. If you are considering purchasing new hardware today or going with a hosting platform or something like the public cloud, the Cloud Sandbox may be a much more agile alternative. And basically what this means is that any workload that you can run in Azure can be managed and controlled through the sandbox. So just to kind of give you some ideas on what you can do is you can run, building proof of concept. So if you're a SharePoint consulting firm, you can certainly use Azure to host and test out your SharePoint farms. You can test out the latest features of SQL Server or Windows Server for that matter. You can run hands-on labs for doing training such as Oracle and SAP, and of course Azure itself if you're trying to learn how to use Azure. And really, really powerful platform. Azure itself is really the underlying engine that makes everything work. We just make it so you can actually control your spending, which is, fantastic for us. All right, so real quick, I want to show a very simple demonstration in Azure itself, just for the people that are brand new to Azure. If you've never really used it, I want to kind of walk through real quick what the capabilities are at a super high level. So the very first thing I'm going to show is I'm going to flip back over to my Azure subscription, and I'm going to go into the Azure portal. And if you're not familiar with the Azure portal, roughly what you're looking at here is on the left navigation, these are the resources that you can navigate and browse to, such as virtual machines, SQL data warehouses, SQL databases, etc. So I'm going to walk you through real quick just to show you how to actually create something in Azure. So how to do that, so I'm going to click New, and you can see all these different categories, such as compute, networking, storage, etc. In my case, I'm actually going to go into compute. And this is the most common area for on-demand lab platforms. And you can see we have lots of cool options here. We have Server 2012. We have the latest Windows Server 2016. We have Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SQL Server 2016, all kinds of other services here. So if I wanted to create a virtual machine running Server 2016 to test the latest and greatest, I literally can go in here and pick or give it a virtual machine name. And I can say whether I want SSD storage or regular hard disks. You give it a username and a password. And I can pick a resource group. Take our training class, you'll know all about resource groups. And here is the regions that I can deploy to. Now remember, we showed you policies where you can control which one of these are. So if you do want to restrict them, you can actually keep track of which region you want your users to deploy to. So we'll go ahead and pick East US. And from there, we can actually pick the right virtual machine size. Now, obviously, these have some ramifications. So you can see that we can pick all kinds of different instance sizes, with 16 cores and even bigger than that, honestly. And that's another thing that you can control with policies using the Cloud Sandbox, is you can control which one of these instances they can actually create virtual machines in. Because as we all know, everyone will pick the most expensive one if you don't tell them otherwise. And here's where we can set up our more advanced networking settings. We won't cover this too much right now. And at the very end, all I have to do is click OK, and it's actually going to spin up a Windows Server 2016 virtual machine that I can connect to using RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol, within just a few minutes. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on Azure because it's just way too big of a topic to cover, but just to kind of give you a little bit more concepts from a lab environment, it's not just about a single instance. We can actually deploy entire solutions here. For instance, if I type in SharePoint, you can see that we have a SharePoint 2013 HA farm. And what essentially this is a multi-node web front end with a middle tier, a back end, SQL cluster, and a Active Directory environment. So if I wanted to test a full-blown SharePoint high available farm, I could easily deploy that with just a few clicks of the mouse. And the same thing that runs this engine is ARM templates can also be incorporated into the Cloud Sandbox. So just like how I showed you can deploy a Visual Studio 2013 image, we can actually incorporate any template that you see here into the Cloud Sandbox, and you can then apply those to all subscriptions in your sandbox. All right, so let's flip back over to the slides real quick. We're almost done, but there is one more topic I want to cover, and that's the most important. How much does it cost and how do you purchase it? Pricing is very simple. We match the same rate that you would purchase it from Microsoft directly. No premiums or surcharges or anything like that to worry about. There are two options available for payment. The first is a pay-as-you-go model. This means that you set the budgets on your subscriptions, and however much you spend, we'll send you an invoice for at the end of the month. The second model is to prepay. This means that you purchase a set amount of Azure. This model works best if you have a fixed budget and you want to avoid any surprises. The next step to purchase the Opsgility Cloud Sandbox is for your organization to contact your account executive from Opsgility. If you're a brand new customer and you've never worked with us before, email us or call us. We'd be happy to take your call and walk you through the process. Thank you very much for attending the webinar. We hope it was very informational.